human shielded alien cubs and became a galactic legend. Of all the creatures to ruin a hunting trip, it had to be a human. Goric, an 8-feet-tall predator with scales like obsidian and claws that could shred steel, crouched silently in the underbrush. His 4 eyes scanned the dense forest, each trained on a different angle of the clearing ahead. The cubs, a trio of fuzzy, wide-eyed Valri younglings, huddled under a root structure, their pale blue fur making them stand out against the dark soil. Goric could already taste victory. He would feast well tonight. Just as he prepared to spring forward, a blur of movement crashed into the clearing. It was a human of all things, and he wasn't even armed. The man wore a tattered jacket, thick boots caked with mud, and an expression that teetered between panic and reckless abandon. He skidded to a stop between the predator and the cubs, arms wide as if he were blocking the path of an oncoming spaceship. "Run!" the human shouted over his shoulder at the terrified cubs. The cubs stared at him, utterly confused, their tiny bodies trembling. They didn't run. Goric stepped out of the underbrush, his claws glinting in the moonlight. "You are not prey," he growled in his guttural tongue, his fangs gleaming. "You are an annoyance." The human didn't flinch. "Yeah, well, I've been called worse," he said. "You are not touching them." The Valri cubs were considered delicacies across 5-star systems, and their hides fetched even higher prices. Goric had hunted dozens of them before, but never had anyone, especially not a scrawny human, interfered. He took another step forward, towering over the man. "You can't win," Goric rumbled. "Step aside, human, or become my appetizer." "No," the human said. His voice was firm, but there was something in his stance that wasn't quite defiance, it was more like resolve. He picked up a broken branch from the ground, gripping it like it was a legendary weapon. Goric laughed, a guttural, echoing sound. "Brave but foolish," Goric said. He lunged. The human was faster than Goric expected. He sidestepped the attack and jabbed the branch into Goric's side. It snapped like a twig against the predator's scales, but the human didn't stop. He grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at Goric's head. It bounced off harmlessly, but it was enough to make the predator pause. "Are you trying to annoy me to death?" Goric asked, more amused than angry. "Just buying time," the human said, his chest heaving. "Come on, little guys, move it." The cubs finally understood the urgency in the human's voice. They bolted from their hiding spot, darting into the thick underbrush. Goric snarled and moved to give chase, but the human threw himself into the predator's path, arms spread wide again. "You'll have to go through me first," the human said, his voice low but steady. "Gladly," Goric growled. The predator lunged again, this time with deadly intent. The human ducked under Goric's claws and rammed his shoulder into the predator's chest. It was like slamming into a wall, but it knocked Goric off balance just enough for the human to roll out of the way and grab another branch. "You are persistent," Goric said, his tone now tinged with irritation. He flexed his claws. "But persistence won't save you." The human didn't reply. His breath came in ragged gasps and sweat dripped down his face, but his grip on the branch tightened. He wasn't going to back down. Goric lunged a third time, swiping with both claws. This time the human wasn't fast enough. One claw raked across his arm, tearing through fabric and skin. Blood seeped into his sleeve, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he swung the branch like a club, smashing it into Goric's face. The predator roared, more in frustration than pain, and reared back. The human used the moment to scramble backward, positioning himself between Goric and the direction the cubs had fled. His legs were shaking, but he planted his boots firmly in the dirt. "You are not very good at staying down, are you?" Goric said, licking the blood from his claw. "Guess not," the human replied, his voice hoarse. For a moment, they stared each other down. Goric could see the human's chest rising and falling rapidly, hear the faint wheeze of his breath. The man was outmatched in every conceivable way: strength, speed, durability, and yet he stood his ground, battered and bleeding, a stubborn spark in his eye. Gorick let out a low growl. Why? Why risk your life for prey that isn't even your own species? The human hesitated, then said, "Because someone has to." It wasn't the answer Gorick expected. Most creatures he hunted begged for mercy or tried to bargain for their lives. But this human didn't ask for anything. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for something else entirely, something that didn't make sense to Gorick. Before the predator could respond, a distant howl echoed through the forest, a deep, resonant sound that made Gorick's spines bristle. He turned his head toward the noise, his four eyes narrowing. "They'll be back soon," the human said. He sounded almost smug. "You might want to leave while you still can." Gorick glared at him, weighing his options. The human was injured, exhausted, and unarmed, but he had managed to stall Gorick long enough for the cubs to escape. And now reinforcements, likely adult Valri, were on their way. With a low snarl, Gorick backed away. "You've made an enemy today, human." "Yeah, well, get in line," the human muttered. Gorick disappeared into the shadows of the forest, his black scales blending seamlessly with the night. In the days that followed, word of the human's actions spread across the galaxy. Stories were told of the lone man who had faced down Valri hunters with nothing but his bare hands and sheer determination. He became a legend, a symbol of the strange, unyielding courage that seemed to define his kind. And though he never sought recognition, the Valri never forgot. To them, he was more than a protector, he was a guardian. The human collapsed to his knees, clutching his wounded arm. He looked around, listening for any sign of the cubs, but they were long gone, safe for now. The forest was quiet again, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the faint drip of blood from his arm. He tore off a strip of his jacket and wrapped it tightly around the wound, grimacing as he pulled the makeshift bandage taut. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was ebbing, replaced by a dull ache that spread through his body. Still, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The cubs were safe for now. But he didn't have time to rest. The distant howl Gorick had reacted to wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Adult Valri would be coming, and unlike the cubs, they wouldn't hesitate to tear apart anything in their path. He didn't know how many there would be, but one thing was certain: staying in one place wasn't an option. The man staggered to his feet, leaning briefly against a tree for support. His eyes scanned the forest, trying to get his bearing. The dense foliage looked the same in every direction, but he remembered seeing a ridge when he'd first entered the area. Higher ground would give him a better view, and hopefully a way to figure out where the cubs had gone. "Come on, legs," he muttered to himself, forcing them to move. Just a little further. The climb to the ridge was brutal. Every step sent a sharp jolt of pain through his injured arm, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. He slipped more than once on the loose soil, barely catching himself before tumbling back down. By the time he reached the top, he was drenched in sweat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But the view was worth it. The forest stretched out before him, an endless sea of green under the pale glow of the planet's twin moon. In the distance, he spotted a faint trail of broken branches leading toward a rocky outcrop. The cubs must have headed that way. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He was about to move when a low growl stopped him in his tracks. Slowly, he turned his head. Standing at the edge of the ridge was another predator, smaller than Gorick, but no less dangerous. Its sleek feline body was covered in dark fur, and its glowing yellow eyes were locked onto the human with predatory intent. This wasn't a hunter like Gorick. This was a scavenger, drawn by the scent of blood. "Great," the man muttered, gripping the nearest branch he could find. It was barely the length of his forearm, but it was better than nothing. "You couldn't have waited until I was dead?" The creature didn't respond, not that he expected it to. It crouched low, muscles coiling as it prepared to pounce. The human braced himself, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He was already running on fumes, and this new threat wasn't helping. When the beast leaped, he swung the branch with all the strength he had left. It connected with a sickening crack, catching the creature across the side of its head. The blow wasn't enough to kill it, but it sent the scavenger skidding across the ground, yowling in pain. Before it could recover, the man lunged forward and drove the jagged end of the branch into its side. The creature let out a final guttural snarl before collapsing. The man stumbled back, nearly losing his balance as the adrenaline surged and then vanished just as quickly. His chest heaved, his vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out, but the sound of movement in the distance snapped him out of it. The Valri. They were getting closer. No rest for the heroic, he muttered bitterly, dragging himself toward the rocky outcrop. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but he couldn't afford to stop, not when the cubs were still out there. As he reached the outcrop, he spotted them, 3 small shapes huddled together in a shallow cave, their wide eyes glinting in the moonlight. They recognized him immediately, letting out soft, plaintive whimpers. Relief flooded through him as he crouched at the entrance. "Hey there, you are," he said, his voice softer now. "You are okay." One of the cubs shuffled closer, sniffing at his injured arm. The man winced but didn't pull away. The little creature let out a curious chirp, its tiny claws patting at his makeshift bandage. For a moment he allowed himself to sit there, just breathing, just existing. Then he heard the howl again, much closer this time. The cubs froze, their fur bristling as they pressed themselves against the cave wall. The human's stomach dropped. He didn't know how many Valri were coming, but if he stayed here, they'd all be cornered. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than the cubs. "Time for plan something." He looked around the cave, searching for anything he could use. The walls were rough, the floor littered with loose stones. His gaze landed on a jagged rock sharp enough to cut. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He picked it up, testing its weight in his good hand. "Stay here," he told the cubs. "No matter what, stay put." The cubs didn't understand his words, but they seemed to sense the urgency in his tone. They pressed themselves even further into the cave, their tiny bodies trembling. The man gave them a small nod before stepping outside, the sharp rock clutched tightly in his hand. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the low growls of predators on the hunt. They were coming. He tightened his grip on the rock, bracing himself for the fight he knew was inevitable. The first Valri emerged from the shadows, its massive frame outlined by the moonlight. Unlike the cubs, its fur was darker, coarser, and its amber eyes glowed with an intensity that sent a chill down the man's spine. Behind it, 2 more followed, each as massive and imposing as the first. Their growls reverberated through the clearing, low and threatening, as they locked eyes on the lone human standing in their path. The man raised his makeshift weapon, a jagged rock hardly worthy of the term. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The cubs were behind him, and there was nowhere left to run. "All right then," he muttered under his breath. "Let's see what you've got." The lead Valri lunged without warning, a blur of fur and teeth. The man sidestepped, swinging the rock with all his strength. It connected with the side of the Valri's head, not enough to cause real damage, but enough to throw it off balance. The predator snarled and lashed out with a massive paw, catching the man across the chest. He stumbled backward, gasping as the force of the blow knocked the wind out of him. Before he could recover, the second Valri charged. This one was faster, more aggressive, coming at him low, aiming for his legs. The man barely managed to leap out of the way, landing hard on the rocky ground. His injured arm screamed in protest as he scrambled to his feet, clutching the rock like it was the only thing keeping him alive. The third Valri hung back, watching, waiting. Its eyes glinted with a predatory cunning that was almost human. The man realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just mindless beasts. They were working together, testing him, wearing him down. "Smart," he muttered, spitting blood onto the ground. "But I've got brains too." The lead Valri attacked again, its jaws snapping inches from his face. This time, the man didn't dodge. Instead, he ducked low and thrust the sharp rock upward, driving it into the soft flesh under the creature's jaw. The Valri howled in pain, rearing back as blood sprayed from the wound. The man stumbled away, breathing hard, his hands slick with blood. The second Valri lunged, but the injured leader snarled, holding it back. The predators regrouped, circling him now, their movements slow and deliberate. They knew he was tiring. He knew it too. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the predators prepared for the final strike. The man tightened his grip on the bloodied rock, his knees shaking but locked in place. His vision blurred, every muscle in his body screaming for him to give up, to run, to do anything but stand there. But he didn't move. Then a roar split the air. It wasn't a Valri roar. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with an authority that silenced even the predators. The man turned his head just in time to see a massive Valri emerge from the trees. This one was even larger than the others, its fur a silvery white that shimmered in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with an almost otherworldly light as it strode into the clearing. The three predators froze, their ears flattening as they lowered their heads in submission. The silver Valri, clearly their leader, let out a low, guttural growl, and the others backed away, retreating into the shadows. The man stared at the silver Valri, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. It stared back, its glowing eyes piercing, as if weighing him, judging him. He held its gaze, refusing to look away. After what felt like an eternity, the silver Valri lowered its massive head, sniffing the air around him. Then, to his shock, it stepped aside, its head turning toward the cave where the cubs were hiding. "They're safe," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know why he was talking to it, but he felt like he had to. "I protected them." The silver Valri let out a soft rumble, almost like a purr. It turned its gaze back to him, and for a moment, he could have sworn it nodded. Then, without a sound, it disappeared into the forest, the other predators following in its wake. The man collapsed to his knees, the rock slipping from his hand. He sat there for a long time, staring at the blood-stained ground, his mind reeling. Finally, he forced himself to his feet and staggered back to the cave. The cubs were still huddled inside, their wide eyes watching him intently. "It's all right," he said, his voice hoarse. "They're gone. You are safe." One by one, the cubs crept toward him, their small bodies pressing against his legs. He reached down, his hand trembling, and gently patted the nearest one on the head. It chirped softly, nuzzling his arm. For the first time in what felt like hours, the man allowed himself to relax. He had survived. They had survived. In the days that followed, word of the humans' actions spread across the galaxy. Stories were told of the lone man who had faced down Valri hunters with nothing but his bare hands and sheer determination. He became a legend, a symbol of the strange, unyielding courage that seemed to define his kind. And though he never sought recognition, the Valri never forgot. To them, he was more than a protector, he was a guardian. Species across the galaxy had long wondered what made humans different. Some called them primitive, others reckless. Most couldn't understand why such a physically unremarkable species had spread so far among the stars. But those who witnessed the tale of the lone human guardian began to understand. It wasn't about physical strength or advanced technology. It wasn't even about survival. It was about standing up when no one else would, about protecting the innocent, regardless of species, about facing impossible odds not because victory was certain, but because it was right. The Valri cubs grew to adulthood, but they never forgot the human who had risked everything to protect them. Their story was passed down through generations, told around gatherings and documented in historical records. They spoke of how a single human, armed with nothing but courage and conviction, stood against both a legendary hunter and a pack of adult Valri. How he faced death multiple times, not for glory or reward, but because someone had to. In time, the incident changed how many species viewed humanity. They began to understand that what they had mistaken for recklessness was often unshakable resolve. What they had dismissed as primitive emotion was actually profound empathy. And most importantly, they learned that true strength isn't measured by claws or fangs or scales, but by the willingness to stand up for others, even at the cost of one's own life. The human never sought recognition for his actions that night. He didn't have to. His legacy lived on in the stories told by the Valri, in the changed perceptions of countless species, and in the simple truth he had demonstrated. Sometimes the greatest warriors aren't those who seek battle, but those who protect others, not because they can win, but because they must try.